This meeting is being recorded.
Oh, more people. What's going on out there? There's some sort of emergency.
Okay. I'm going to try and do Mellow Faye. Thanks for coming. This is the last of the webinars that we are doing in spring of the Proposal Development Workshops 2.0. So thank you very much for attending. The point of this workshop series in the spring was to explore some additional topics that were above and beyond the fundamentals of proposal development. The fundamentals are addressed in the fall through our Proposal Development Workshop 1.0 series. We'll start scheduling those soon, so I encourage you to check funding.asu.edu or Research Academy for when those come up. We'll be scheduling those probably over the summer. Anyway, this workshop has to do with pivoting your message. And they'll go into the description, but my job right now is to introduce who you will be listening to today. I'm really pleased that our presenters today are from elsewhere on campus, not KED. So in my role in research development, I'm Faye Farmer. In research development, we work with units across campus to develop proposals to federal sponsors primarily, and try and make the best of our faculty come out on the written page. The two people who are presenting today are hugely dedicated to that effort, so I want to recognize them as the experts that they are and what they bring to the table. Part of what I've asked them to do is think through how they do what they do in a different way for this webinar. So we are interested in your feedback. Please keep it lively, keep the interaction. Tell them what you do, think about what you do and how it applies to what they're advising you to do, or actually to think about. So Michelle comes, she works at Biodesign. She'll give you a little bit more of a background for her, but she recently joined ASU a year ago, and we're hoping to see more of her at some of these presentations, and hopefully as a talking head here. And Juliana Carsen is at Teachers College, who works as a part of that team to put in large-scale proposals through, and small-scale proposals, all kinds of proposals through the Teachers College. But I just want to say thank you very much for both of you giving of your time and energy today. And with that, I will let you, and online, please note that you have to use the chat function to ask questions, but LJ is here in the audience and she will capture your information and present and ask the question. It is also being recorded, so please keep in mind that everything will be captured for posterity. And thank you very much.
So I want to thank Faye because I am relatively new here. I've been hunkered down in Biodesign Institute for a year, working on deadline after deadline, and this has been really fun, working with Juliana and really thinking a little bit more deeply about the things that we work on. So when I was given this topic, we had a brainstorming session and they showed me the taglines. This is not working now. And they put this tagline and find that money, but I actually really hate that. So what I'm going to tell you is I want us to explore the possibilities today. I don't want you to think of it as going for money, but I want you to think of it as developing your research, developing who you are, and getting money for that research. So who are we? I've been 10 years working on proposals full-time, but I have many more years where I worked in biomedical research. So I come from the biomedical teaching hospital side, and I was in the lab, but I was also writing manuscripts, doing data management, and working with pharma and a variety of other things until I got into full-time grant work.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm Juliana Carsen. I'm from the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College. I've been with ASU for 2 years now. I have a pretty diverse background from military, government, nonprofit, to now in academia. About 16 years in communications and mass communications, and the grant writing side is where I've really started focusing and honing my skills the last few years.
And I would just want to plug her that this is very valuable thinking, and it really contributed to what we're working on today, which was we want to represent campus.
And so, for all you folks online, you can't jump in, so I'm sorry about this, but think about this. I went on ASU brand guide this week, and I realized there's 16 colleges and schools at ASU, which I thought was phenomenal. It seems like quite a bit. But then I dug in a little deeper and actually looked at the list of centers, institutes, and every other form of academic study and research here at ASU, and I couldn't even count how many were on that list. So the concept that we're kind of bringing today with this presentation is that pivoting your message is a bit of an ambiguous term. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. It can be applied in different contexts. But Michelle's going to kind of highlight the more hard science biomedical context, and I'm going to try to help supplement with all you folks that are in the softer sciences, social sciences, and humanities.
And when we're going through this, I want you all to think of get an idea how many of you are thinking of pivoting.
And so, yeah.
Okay, and how many of you have pivoted, have tried to pivot? Okay, so this is great because this talk is going to be part philosophy, part psychology, and it's going to be some boots on the ground information to some examples that we're both going to counterpoint from our perspective. So let's think about what we're doing today. What do we mean by pivoting? Because this, as she said, is an ambiguous term. We're going to talk about that, and also why should you pivot your message? What are you trying to achieve? And then we're going to get a little bit into what's in the pivot toolkit. All of this to make you think a little bit more when you're starting to pivot or deciding whether to pivot. And so what do we mean by pivoting? So on my side, a lot of times it's shifting and turning.
And it can get very ambiguous, especially in the social sciences. It can be a conceptual change of thought, how you frame and approach your objective, your proposal, the focus that you bring to that proposal. It can also be a physical, a less conceptual, more logistical reframe by who you're partnering with, how you're assessing your capabilities, and even if you're trying to get into a new area of science, how you go about that. The term can be used in different ways.
So when we did the brainstorming, we came up with a couple different things, also repurposing, redirecting. And why is this important? Does anybody ever feel this way? Have you ever tried to pivot in your personal life and what you call a colossal failure that jeopardizes everything? I call that a pivot. So, you know, we're in the grants business, right, with this. And there's going to be a lot of no awards. And it's not failure because that's what you got to do. You got to try. But you have to make decisions along the way. So I tried to come up with a really positive, solid definition of pivot that I like, because there's a lot of pivot definitions in the dictionary. But I like this idea of this, that a pivot is the central point, pin, or shaft which a mechanism turns or oscillates on. I find this to be a really helpful thing when thinking about all the different experiences that I've had with pivoting. And so there's so many things you could say. There's a lot of different types of pivots. So I'd like you to think of it in different ways. There's conceptual pivots, like what am I working on and what kind of conceptual shift, you know, do I need to make? But I've also had to work with a lot of faculty on stylistic pivots, your writing style, the way that the grant looks, the organization of it, what is the agency looking for? So I want you to think about this when you're looking at a program opportunity, there's these different ways that you could try to pivot. So what's our different perspective here? When might pivoting the message be needed? And, you know, on the science side, a lot of times for me, it's been definitely across the career span. People of all kinds come to me, faculty at postdoc from all the way to senior faculty stages have contacted me for input. And then across the federal agencies, this is very common. We're going to give some examples, but then we have Juliana's perspective.
Which that same context applies, I think, across the board in most different domains of science and academia. But there's kind of a key up here, the American Recovery Act. We were just talking about this a moment ago. Economic stimulus and some of the other environments that the federal government had operated in the last decade have themselves pivoted, have changed, have shifted, have turned. And to respond to that many faculty that I've spoken to in the last year and grant writers across the nation have advised going kind of back to the pre-economic stimulus strategies of approaching foundation-based funding, and then moving into the federal space as you get into your mid and later stages of your career, or after the federal funding environment shifts again. So from federal to foundation, that's what we're looking at here. And that requires a shift in your tone, your style, the logistical elements that you might include in a proposal. Evaluation's probably going to be high on the list. And different aspects are going to be of higher value if you're talking federal to foundation. And then a shifting disciplinary focus. At the Teachers College, we are in kind of a unique position where when we're talking about education, that can mean many things to many folks. And we can specialize, or our PIs can specialize in curriculum, in evaluation, and many different aspects that is a tool in and of itself that can be inter and transdisciplinary applied in those different contexts very easily. We also have a lot of subject matter experts that are affiliated now with our college, and more come along the way, and that kind of helps expand the type of opportunities that they can apply to, but it also might stretch the boundaries of how they're seen in their discipline and what other disciplines they might be reaching into.
And I want to say these are very broadly applicable. So in the early stage, you're just trying to get your first grant, right? But when you're in your mid stage, you're also trying to diversify your funding portfolio. So you at every stage in your career, you have these needs for pivoting. And so digging a little deeper, what kind of factors do you have to consider? And I mean, this is on the left is my master list. I look, a lot of times it's the scope and the fit of the funding announcement. Can you fit it with what you're doing? There's also lots of submission requirements, new forms, new language, new terminology. The target audience may be completely different, DoD with military relevance, and you have to start thinking about those things. But actually, a huge area is the status of your data. I mean, where are you at in your project? What level of risk are you looking at? Do you have a lot of data, no data, a great creative idea? You have to understand some of these factors, and I'm always basically going through this checklist when I look at a new funding announcement to help somebody pivot.
Yeah, and we make it sound like it's, you know, this real easy shift, turn, change, but should you pivot? And so these are some of those factors that you need to kind of really look at in a logistical and practical sense and say, okay, am I positioned to actually make a change that you're contemplating? And some of the lesser black and white areas you may want to consider are capacity access, groundwork, partnerships. That's, have you laid the groundwork? And as Michelle kind of alluded to, do you have the data to make a shift into a new area, or to get into curriculum, or to do an evaluation? Partnerships, it's easy to say we're going to partner with a school district, we're going to partner with a community college, we're going to partner with industry or a small business. It's very different to actually bring that partnership together and everyone to the table and everyone speaking the same language. So when we talk about access and partnerships, those two aspects can often be overlooked or assumed that you're going to partner and that'll be an easy process. That's usually one of the most difficult processes of grant writing and pivoting in general, and the most lengthy. They take time to develop partnerships.
And so just to dig a little bit deeper here, we want to share with you some examples of very specific pivots. We're also going to give you some examples of successful pivots. But on my side, a lot of times we're talking about going to a different funding mechanism within an agency like NIH. So for example, going from a grant where you can basically apply to do either anything you want, an unsolicited program announcement, or to do a specific research project, but you don't have too much oversight. You have yearly progress reports. But a lot of times people want to shift to a cooperative agreement where you have a lot more agency oversight. They're actually involved in determining what whether they agree with your milestones, they're going to monitor your milestones and the project that you're working on. But this is actually really fundamental. A lot of work I've done in this area, helping people pivot to different federal agencies, either from NIH to DOD, from NIH to NSF, or from NSF to USDA. And I just want to plug that there's going to be a kickoff on a new USDA opportunity. So if you're interested in pivoting, you want to get information on the differences between these agencies and what their perspectives are.
Mm-hmm. Sponsor needs usually trump your interests. So that's always a good thing to keep in mind. And the grant and cooperative agreement, very different. You lose your creative control with those cooperative agreements. So going back again to our federal to foundation pivot, shift, turn. NIH early career, not just NIH, but NSF career, the Department of Defense early investigator awards, a lot of these early career level awards across most federal funding agencies invest in the investigator. And unless it's a cooperative agreement, they have a very specific outcome in mind that they want to accomplish and achieve. NIH is kind of renowned for investing in a person's career and hoping to establish a long-term relationship with that investigator. Not always the case in foundations. They usually have a societal challenge in mind, or a big world type problem that they're trying to solve. And it can be challenging and difficult to see yourself, if you're, let's say, funded by NIH, to see yourself in that foundation space and that funder's perspective and how they want your research to look for them, how it's going to serve their purpose. We have, in the Teachers College, seen that successfully done between NIH to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. They have much of the same interests aligned, but that's taking the hard biomedical science into a more softer social perspective of how you're going to affect societal change. And then perspectives, experience, and exposure. There is a very interesting funding announcement that the William T. Grant Foundation has. It's focused on young or early career investigators that have a hard science background, STEM, technology, engineering, math, and exposing that mindset to the softer sciences. So like social emotional learning, character development, qualitative research. And the intent is to create a deeper, broader perspective of their science and of societal challenges, and to expose them to mixed methods, quasi-experimental, and some of the fringe type elements of science and how projects can be brought together. So deeper, broader.
So we really recognize that, these pivots can be very difficult. So I wanted to give you a closer look and give you an example, which is within NIH shift from this research project in R01 to a cooperative agreement. It could be a U01 or there's various different U's. And the thing is, you basically want to look at the program announcement, and from the very first pass, you can kind of see that you're going from an unsolicited project in the first announcement with the parent R01 to a very specific call for applications. It's a narrow scope, so you're going to have to really take into account you got to try to understand what they're looking for. And again, it's a U, so the agency is going to be involved. So there needs to be a lot of communication with the agency even before you submit, because you want to get an understanding of what kinds of things that they are interested in funding. But when I wanted to give you at least one simple tool, so I said, well, what's in this cooperative agreement? And when I search the cooperative agreement, I see there's 27 terms: milestone, well-defined end goals, specific endpoints, intermediate quantitative milestones, go, no-go milestones, very scary. Specific rigorous milestones. What do they mean by rigorous? So you come up with this and you realize that you're going to have a little bit of a different way of communicating. And so I came up with this timeline table that's a little bit of a step forward from what you typically would do in an NIH grant, where I provide this key pivot where you have a very concise format here where you put your endpoints and your target values in a table, in addition to laying out your assays and the analysis, because you want to be able to communicate to the agency that you can achieve the milestones, because it's very obviously milestone driven based on the program announcement, and they're going to actually monitor your progress based on these milestones. So you want it to be sharp, because every period they're going to look at you and say, have you achieved these, and if not, why not? So this is a very nice thing to keep in your toolkit. There's one thing I can say about it, which is I want to give you an example of an actual person, a faculty member, and how she used this table to actually pivot across the spectrum. She came to me as a visiting scientist. She wasn't actually allowed to submit grants as a PI. So she had this NASA space biology grant that she was interested in. She wrote the grant and she submitted it with the PI who was her postdoctoral mentor. There's all kinds of forms and terms, and they won't communicate with you at all. You can't get information about where they drop samples and this kind of thing, but you know, you have set parameters. You have to have X number, you can't exceed X number of mice. So we just followed the program announcement and she got it. She was one of a very few, and eventually this grant was transferred to her as PI, and she got her first faculty position in the US. So I came back to her. She's working on R01s and she's trying and she's not getting. And I saw this NIH CASIS, which CASIS is an agency that handles space work. It's kind of an intermediary with NASA. And I said, here's a cooperative agreement, and it's really a good fit for you. It's a little different, it's a little challenging, but we can work on it together. And that's when I came up with the milestone table. And it's really hard at first because it's change, right? You have to change your thinking. You have to be really concrete. It's not just generally over 5 years, what are you going to do? So she mastered this, and she was one of a handful of people. So now she's really solid with NASA and her work. She's got 2 different projects, by the way, completely different projects. And then she's still trying to get this R01 because everybody wants the 5-year stable funding, right? But along the way, she found opportunities for a state biotech grant. Same thing, they want to know your milestones because they're funding technology and they want to make sure it's achievable. She found a private foundation that funds stem cell research. Same thing, very few awards, very competitive. She got both of these. She got a supplement on her NIH CASIS grant using the same methodology, just here's what I want to do, here's the cost of each element. And she got it, and then meanwhile still working on her R01, and she got her R01. But I want to say she got a lot of triaged grants, and she grew up, and she used this for her R01. She used the concept of a milestone table. What am I going to do? What can I achieve? Because she's still kind of an early faculty member. But when she got this NIH CASIS grant, this is when she got promoted to tenure. And I said, you know what, this is great. She's still working on her R01, hadn't got it yet. I said, there's this really amazing opportunity. It looks like it was written for you, but it's NSF, so pivot. Why is it a big pivot? One, it's NSF, basic research. This is not her thinking. She's in a med center, always been. But I said, you know, you're going to have to, you can use, she said, can I use this? And I said, yeah, sort of. NSF style, very different. Terminology different, but the main thing here, engineering directorate. They said, you're going to have to write it to the engineering directorate. But she said, I just had a startup. My biotech startup just got approved. And I said, this is a perfect opportunity for you to learn how to use that pivot. You're developing methods for producing the stem cells rather than trying to understand the stem cells. Technology, you have to plug the engineering side of things. And this is where we stand. She basically got all of these, and she's waiting to hear about her NSF award. She has a very solid program now. She has a suite of projects, and she has a solid program, and all of her her wonderful staff is now funded for long term.
I'm curious, what is the timeline on that?
2014 to now. That's a great question, because this seems, it's big, and it's a lot of grants, many R01s, multiple R01 topics around these things. But you know, NASA work is unique, so you have to wait for the call. This call was very, very specialized, so you know, you have to do it within the parameters that they're asking for. The same with this, but this was even more narrow. The U was really very narrow. Two-phase, all your milestones have to be set up with, the go, no-go is between the UG3 and the UH3. So you have to have some really solid go, no-go milestones, or they may not fund you on the UH3 part. Now this is 5 years, but you don't get all 5 years in the first notice of grant award. You only get the first piece, the UG3, and that's what you'll see in an NIH reporter. So you have to really, they're tracking those milestones. You have to be a believer in those milestones. But this is a pretty, this is a good example. It's a hard example, but I do believe that just with some simple changes in thinking in the heart, it's very hard to get people. I've had a lot of pushback when I give people that milestone table. They don't want to do it. Oh, they don't need to do that. Because actually in the R01 program announcement, it actually doesn't even say you need a timeline. It's expected, but it's not required. So I tell people it's not required, but you should do it.
Do you ever see folks just copy all the content from their first grant that they know that's working well and paste it into the next
this is exactly
announcement
what she did.
And say, okay, we're good to go?
She actually took her NIH cases grant and copied and pasted it. And I said,
did it work?
No, well, I said, we can't do that. We can't do that. But, you know, we're going to stage it. Change in thinking. A little bit more creative opportunity. NIH is very, you need this section, this section, this session. NSF is a little bit more flexible. But then again, this is you know, cases, so it's a very narrow project. It's not as creative as some of the NSF opportunities where you can just structure the grant how you want it, but I had to get her to let go of some of the NIH headings because they don't fit, and then NSF doesn't want to see a copycat. So yeah, a lot of changes and I had to get her to emphasize the engineering element to bring other biomedical engineers in her expert group. So she's in a very strong department. There are a lot of, she actually has NASA astronauts in her department. And I said, you know, you need to bring some of the engineering into it. And she does that. She, you know, she's happy to go out and ask people to work with her and plug her contacts. So that's really important to expand, to show that she is working with engineers. And she has the perspective, because otherwise, you know, it's just another NIH grant.
That's that other little element of that pivoting. You've got to have that groundwork and those resources and partnerships established.
And this was so important because like we literally had no idea where they dropped the samples. So we didn't know the logistics of whether she could do this. But I said to her, when we came to this second opportunity, you've got the implementation partner. We didn't even know what that meant. But you've been working with an implementation partner. You don't just have to pick off the list. I mean, how awkward. But now you have it. You can go there and ask them questions. We would post questions to their Gov thing to ask them stuff, and we never heard back. But now she knows everybody. She actually goes and gives presentations. She goes to, you know, the launches, and she knows the people who are running these facilities. So she can ask anything that she wants if she's not sure. And this is where she did lay the groundwork for what she achieved. It's very important. I mean, this was daunting. There's so many forms. There's so much lingo. We weren't even sure if we were getting it right. But I said, well, just let's not embarrass ourselves. We follow the instructions, right? I mean, we just follow every instruction exactly the way it's written as we understand it. And I can guarantee you that most of the people who got this had been doing NASA work before. But we didn't have time. She didn't have collaboration. She didn't know anybody. So we had nobody to contact. And they really literally will not answer your emails. So that is how you lay the foundation. It's a gradual process in time, for sure.
Got a question real quick in the audience. We're going to wait for the microphone real quick so the folks online can hear what she's going to ask.
Thank you. I'm not new to grant writing, and I actually used to be a grant administrator, but I'm new to research grants in the academic setting. And you're throwing out a lot of terms about R01s and maybe U101s and then UG3s and UH3s. I'm not familiar with any of that. Would you mind defining that a little bit?
I can take that one. This is 2.0. So those are actually covered in the series of workshops that we did in the fall, and I can send those recordings. They're also available on our funding.asu.edu website, but it's much more of an in-depth, like how to understand what you're reading, breaking down a solicitation, figuring out where you're going. In particular, for sponsors, for NIH, we actually have a subscription to Meg Bouvier, and she does an excellent breakdown on mechanism and how to pursue it and how to evaluate your mechanism for NIH specifically. So there are a lot of code words, but understanding your sponsor is part of that workshop, and then also going out and researching online what your sponsor wants and how they code word everything.
And just to plug that, I've heard feedback from some of the faculty who have gone to those workshops, and they really benefited from doing that. So definitely a good thing to do. So let's move on, because I want to pass off a little bit of opportunity for the counterpoint here.
Okay, so again, that was a harder science, biomedical kind of view on what pivot means in this context. And there's different terms. So we heard the term track, I heard the term program, and that was, in my understanding, in Teachers College and how we refer to those concepts, we'd probably call that a research agenda. So there's different terms. We're saying the same thing, just using different words. But let's look at this in a little more parsed out level. So at the investigator level, you can ask yourself and try to consider, when we were discussing earlier about, well, should you pivot? Is this the best time to pivot? Is your groundwork laid? Is this going to be a waste of your time? Or is this something that you're going to figure out as you go, but it's a pretty good fit? You've got a gut instinct that this might be the right avenue to move into. So the basics, where do you want to be? Where do you want to go? How do you want to get there? What do you want your career to look like in 3 to 5 years? And hopefully it'll be in an area where you still want to get up in the morning and go to work happily, in a good mood, and enjoy what you do. So at the investigator level, the individual level, where do you want your career to go? As an investigator, you can pivot. Your project that you're working on can pivot. If you're in a domain of science and astrophysics and you want to do curriculum, that's a slight pivot. And then your program, now this was what I think Michelle was referring to as your research agenda, kind of what the whole picture looks like, or the track that you're on and you're building, that can pivot as well. So we're going to get a little bit more in depth with actual examples of what this looks like. We're going to get a little less ambiguous, which we've purposefully done to this point. And so this is someone that I think my colleague who's in our audience today, Jeannie Wilson, worked with recently here at Arizona State University. I was a geochemist on campus who had a phenomenal background and experience, but did a very unusual pivot. It went from a NASA and very hard science focused funding mechanisms to the Department of Education, and was successful. You don't hear that very often, especially at the multi-million-dollar level. But he was able to take his expertise and name recognition and turn that into an online curriculum that was a pretty logical transition, but the narrative, the proposal, the way he framed himself and his experience had to be shifted or reframed. That was the other term that we were kind of saying also meant pivoting in our context. We've also seen successful pivot or reframe at the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College within, or with an investigator that was, again, hard science, STEM oriented, that went into psychology. And that's another unusual mixture that you don't see very often. But the cognitive and learning science came out of that. So they went from understanding content deeply to understanding learning across the lifespan deeply, and what those two things meant in the context of learning STEM and cognition and how humans learn, and created a whole deeper area of science that's now been receiving multiple awards. So that was kind of an interesting dynamic.
Very interesting, yeah.
But a good example of pivoting.
Big pivots, big pivots. So I want to present, again, some examples of I've given some examples of projects with my previous slides, but talk a little bit more about program pivots. And here are two examples that I can think of where you really have to think about reframing, because I have worked with this environmental health researcher, and he basically had, early in his career, got an NIHK award, and then he got research project funding for his, specific projects. But what he developed over time is he was the associate dean for research in his college, and he basically was very interested in mentoring early career faculty. And he found this opportunity, and while it was an environmental health center, and yes, it was a multi-project grant, one of the key features was for him shifting to show that he could lead a multi-project initiative, but also there was a component of this center where he was developing early stage career faculty. And so he had to sort of pivot to show how he was going to do that. And what he did was he made a specific early career faculty his assistant director for the center. So, pivoting, he had to think about, how am I going to show how I'm actually going to do this thing, to go from, solid investigator, senior, but he wanted to be a leader in the field, and he wanted to bring more opportunities for projects to the earlier career faculty. That's what he did. He got a P50 on his first shot, by the way. Very, very incredible shift. I also worked with a chemical virologist, and what's a chemical virologist? He actually named himself this. This is how he named his field. He's a chemist who develops tools that are useful for virology. And he had the usual thing, which he was trying to get these small 2-year research project grants from NIH. And, it's like any other NIH grant where you say, here's what I'm going to do over the 2 years, and have to talk about innovation. But then he had to shift, because what he really wanted was, of course, long-term stable funding to establish his program. He was new recruit to University of Arizona. Sorry, guys. And he basically, it was incredible. I had looked at his R21 and commented on it, but then I saw he got this award, completely different style. Because what is he doing? He's describing himself as an investigator, but also the program that he wants to develop. Not just one specific project, but where is he going? And he basically put out on his website that he's a chemical virologist. And, so showed how his program is basically going to create a whole new field. And this is how he succeeded, by pivoting his thinking from being really specific to being really,
generalist?
Generalist, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how's he going to train, NSF, how's he going to train his students? He had a really cool, broader impacts. So again, NIH, they don't care about that. R21, what are you going to do in the lab? Shifted, really different writing style, very successful.
Paradigm shift, I think, in that case.
Complete paradigm shift, yeah. To think about his future. What do I want to do eventually?
Mm-hmm.
He can only do this much now because he only had his startup package, but he was looking to the future, and he did it. So that's the dream. This is what their brainstorming session gave us, is this idea that pivoting is also growth, evolution, maturity. You can see by some of these examples that over time, this is the dream. You still have your pin, your pinpoint, but you're learning how to go up and be acrobatic around that. And if you can do that, it's really amazing. You can get money for things that you want to do that you never perhaps thought you could do, and you can really grow. So I want to leave you guys with the idea that you don't do this alone. The chemical virologist had a solid network. Inside his institution, he had a really great mentoring committee that read his grants and helped him understand the agencies. And he also had a really incredible suite of advisors outside of his institution that he consulted with, senior people in the field, because what you learn is that each person has something. And you actually need to learn how to find the people You get the data about what people have tried. You look up the awards database and you find people who have gotten the awards. What did they go through? And you can talk to them about what you're thinking. And you get this, you build your network. This is what's going to help you pivot successfully. One of the things that's coming up that I think could be really helpful is if you're interested in pivoting to NIH or within NIH, is that ASU is actually hosting, sorry, it's not at ASU, but in Phoenix, ASU is actually hosting the NIH grant conference, and you can meet the program officers and present them your ideas in private sessions, and you can learn about all the institutes and centers and how they differ. I've had a big learning curve here because I work a lot now with NIGMS. Very unique in NIH. So I encourage you to look up whatever agency you're looking at, see if they have webinars, or even better to go in person, as I've been told. NSF has a grant conference coming up. It's kind of full up, but you can click on this button at the link and get notified. And I really can't say enough about it because I spend a lot of time trying to get early stage faculty to communicate with the program officers. And the more you do that, the better off you are. Sometimes you can just meet them at your subject matter meetings, but this is a great way because that's what they're doing. They're traveling the country.
And now we're going to bring it back to Faye.
Back to Faye.
So I just want to mention that the Amazon proposals as best practice is today. You can stream it. You don't have to register for it, but I think if to register for it, you get the link for it. So I guess register for it. The CCI is the Center for Chemical Innovation Opportunity. It's very specific to chemistry. If you have no interest in that, don't do it. USDA AFRI is a larger scale kickoff, opportunity kickoff. Both of those are opportunity. Actually, the next three are opportunity kickoffs. That means that there are solicitations that we are going to discuss and try and do team building afterwards. USDA AFRI is interesting in that it's one of the few that we can actually apply for. And then for USDA, and the NIH Directors Program opportunity is one that's for biomedical scientists who are, it's very, very competitive, but it's worth going to see if you have any interest at all in applying for very specifically funded research. Like talk about pivot. It's like narrow program concepts. But all of these give you an opportunity to think about, and I love the segue, Juliana, about other sponsors, right? So if you go and see how these other opportunities are talked about and what was important or important to the program or the past award background that we'll talk about, that informs your view of that sponsor and how to respond. So I love that message. And then is that done? Because
yep, that's it.
I can say.
And vulnerability. LJ, being vulnerable to that pivot. Are you comfortable with that concept?
So I just want to thank you very much. I heard some great messages in this presentation. And I do know that there are certain words that we use by portfolio or background or discipline. But I want to assure you that all of the messaging that I heard today was appropriate to anyone. If you're doing research in education, research in arts and humanities, these are all really key messages for thinking about how you grow as a person over the life of your career, and then also how you grow your research, right? So different scales. So with that, are there any questions online? Because Dana has one inside. LJ's going to do it.
My question is regarding a PI who has tried for NIH a couple of times and then pivoted to try for NSF. We haven't heard the results of that, but my feeling is that if that is not successful or very close to being successful, she needs to pivot and maybe try a different project because clearly it's not going well. So how do you have, as a grants, more of a, development person rather than a PI, how do you have that conversation with a PI about, I think maybe it's time to do something different?
She's not getting at NIH?
She tried twice to get an NIH and failed. She previously had.
Twice is nothing. Twice is
At least
nothing.
3 before you
At
give
least
up.
3.
You know what I did for this, the example that I gave of the faculty member that had this trajectory is she got very discouraged after many more than 2, and different topics, different times, and resubmissions. And I actually made her a table, and I said, you've gone from unscored to scored. You know, what's happening? You want to look at the faculty member. Part of the conversation should be what's happening. Is there improvement? Is there not improvement? And look at those comments, and are they being addressed? Are they not being addressed? A lot of times people try and they don't try again, so 2 is not much. You can go back now with a 3rd, but it's new.
Right. So I think it's actually been more than one submission. It's been sort of 2 different
Projects.
areas within the same thing. And sort of because I've edited a few of these, my sort of fundamental feeling is maybe it's not wow enough. The whole idea just isn't wow enough to get funded. So I'm kind of putting my spin on it. So that's why I was thinking of having the conversation.
So one of the things I say to people, I just gave a talk on this recently, that there's absolutely no peer review criteria that cannot be overcome. So even if you don't think it's wow, then it's not written wow enough. Because there's all kinds of things that get funded that are not wow. I can tell you because I spend a lot of time with the data, okay? And it's interesting because one of the things I actually took it out of my presentation, I wish I had it as a backup slide, was talking about grant architecture and looking at the grant and how it's structured. Because a lot of times the wow is kind of buried, the data, the background data. The way that things are written can be definitely improved, even when you get a comment like, that it's not innovative. You just have to rethink it. If she's working on it, she's getting published. So somebody thinks it's worth publishing, right? So the question is, why isn't she selling it? Does she believe it's interesting? Yes. And is she saying why? So I have a couple of tools, and I can share an article that I wrote about this with you in group. I wrote an article about using design principles, basically, to restructure your grant. Because a lot of times, even experienced, grant writers that have been funded for 35 continuous years bury their message, or they don't succinctly say why something is innovative, and they don't do things like they don't properly address their competitors. Even very, very experienced directors do this. And so there's a lot that I would advise not to necessarily jump from sponsor to sponsor, but what do you think? I'm curious what you would say when you saw this, how she depicted the problem.
And it was reviewed? Yes. With commentary?
Yes.
So we do a debrief with our PIs, and me and Jeannie are still kind of trying to flesh out what that should look like, but it's a very objective, passive document, because the I am can hurt when you say things a certain way. So we do a very simple pro-con, positive, negative. We don't call it that. Opportunities for growth. You massage that message. But then we put it into a very simplified matrix, and sometimes we'll color code depending on which agency it is. And that shows them the priority areas under those topics. And then all just black and white. You add in the reviewer comments, and when you see it in that environment, it's black and white. And if she's had more than just one review and 2 submissions?
She came to us after she'd been somewhere else for a few years, so I'm not exactly sure about the details.
Where it's at. You usually hear it. If more than one reviewer is saying it, that's when me and Jeannie will put it in that comment box and say, this is here. You might want to pay attention to that. Because it's subjective much of the time. And you can, if you're not the subject matter expert, and even if you give it to a subject matter expert, well, you know, what was the environment that it was reviewed in, who was reviewing it? It's not a precise science.
Thank you.
I had a quote that I was going to put in, which came from actually a review here that I've seen that's basically, you know, the reviewer didn't get it. How many people heard that?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
the reviewer didn't get it. The reviewer's stupid. I mean, it gets worse. Okay, Gets emotional. If the reviewer didn't get it, it's because you didn't write it the way the reviewer should get it, but it's hard to get that message across. But that is what you have to overcome. I mean, you have to, that's a great technique, making a table, because you're taking out the emotion. I call it taking out the emotion. This is, and what I say, unfortunately, I get a lot of people coming to me and saying they didn't get it, and they didn't work with me on the first submission because they thought they had it. But you actually, once you have the reviews, there's just no turning, right? I mean, you have to address it. That's the bottom line when you talk to somebody who comes to you, is they have to address the comments. And what most often happens in my, when people come to me and I didn't work with them, is they don't address the comments. They resubmit and they haven't actually addressed the comments because they weren't ready to really say, yeah, this is valid.
Or they do it so differently.
It could be not valid.
It opens up a whole new set of questions. It's like shut down the question.
True. Yeah. And you know, so it's a critical thing to analyze why. I think what you're saying is you're trying to figure out what it is, but if you actually put the comments in a grid,
and they're telling you,
usually it comes out as being very obvious. So.
Back to the pivot and understanding. So if you're getting that feedback, and if you choose to pivot, which was the original question, and it's great because we have so many fixers in the room, so they will fix your problem for you. But the pivot, if she goes for something else, what does she need to do? Is understand what the audience needs, and the next step for her is, and to actually have that opportunity for growth discussion to say, if this well is dry for now, what's the new well? And then spend a lot of time figuring out that new well, because if she's in an emotionally depressed spot and gets rejected again a couple times, which will definitely happen, then that's not a successful pivot.
What I would say is, you know, use the positive message with the three, we had the slide with the 3 areas: investigator. Ask her those questions. Why is she going to NSF? Is it because she thinks she can get money because she's not getting it in NIH?
She actually started to change the focus, and I think the NSF was actually
a good fit.
Choice. I think the NSF call was actually good for her, so we'll be interested to see what happens.
Right.
But
no online questions?
With our team also, we take that, the time when we're giving that the debrief and the feedback, we take that time when we have time to kind of slide in the competitive intelligence and to say, have you thought about this opportunity, that opportunity, this foundation? Or have you thought about, there are other potential collaborators at ASU or a conference that's coming up? And not the full SWOT, you know, the threats and the opportunities, but just a real light kind of, here's what that type of your science, here's what we're seeing at the, 30,000 foot view. And that can also help them sometimes get out of that hysteria, and depression, and refocus, and remotivated.
This is a good point. I'm glad you brought up competitive intelligence, because I was going to put a slide on that and I kind of forgot about it. But competitive intelligence is really important. So I can give you an example here that I want my director to go for one particular funding opportunity. And I looked up in the database and found out that one of the ASU faculty had one. And so I said, let's meet. And it turns out that he's on the panel, the study section. And so there's no way I could have known that, because they're the rare non-published study sections. And what he told us was very enlightening. So really insider competitive intelligence right there. And that should inform what you do. Whether you like it or not, it's what the agency is doing. It's their review process, and he called our attention to some really important factors.
I was going to put in a pitch for another webinar. So in the fall, we do a competitive intelligence webinar. Know your sponsor. So with that, I do want to acknowledge the incredible feat of time and energy that went into this presentation. I know that there were at least 10 slides that you took out, and I appreciate that. but we'll make that into another presentation and make Michelle and Juliana come back. So thank you very much for your time today, and thank you all for logging in. Thank you in the audience too. So,
Thank you for coming.
okay. And let me know if you have any questions, research development, all one word, at asu.edu. And have a great summer if we don't see you.